Hey guys, and welcome to Faewood. So this is the next video of my necklace, and we're going to continue on with Aughra's Observatory in this one. So in my last video I was starting the wirework process, and I also showed you how I made the little planets and added the gold leaf and everything onto those as well. And in this one you'll see me finishing off all of the planets and things, and how I put the placement of all the planets and do the wire work for the rest of these elements and things like that. So you really want to have a think about where you want these elements to be, and in particular for my necklace, because I've got the planet there, that part I need to really think about, where do I want that planet to sit over the beadwork? What am I happy to sort of obscure slightly with this wire work, because remembering that, you know, while you can see a little bit, if you sit to either side of the wire work you can sort of see past it, it will obscure some of what's underneath. So if you really want what's underneath to be visible, then consider that when you're thinking about doing this wire work. You know, do you even want the wire work is a thing to consider as well. So I wanted to make sure that by eye you could see all of the planets, and I didn't want them too evenly spaced, because that wouldn't look natural. It would look too much like a pattern. When I made the planets as well, I really wanted to make sure they were different sizes. So that was something I definitely considered. And then you start to put your base wire in, which is the 18 gauge. This is the structural wire that you'll use to wrap around. Now definitely sew it on the back before you start any of the wrapping, because it will move otherwise and you'll have a nightmare of a time trying to do your wire wrapping. So I definitely try and make sure I know exactly where everything will be placed. I make sure I sew each of those points in the backing so that it's not going anywhere, and really make sure you're happy with the shape of it too, because if you try and change the shape of that structural wire mid-wrap, then things might become loose or too tight or what have you. So you really want to make sure you spend some time getting that right. So I'm actually doing this part of the wire wrapping over the top of that last piece that I did. I actually wasn't too happy with the way this flowed. So each of those wire wrapping sections that I'm doing, you can see I'm just doing 2 bits of wire and keeping it pretty simple as far as the wrapping pattern. But I wanted a really nice line that flowed up, and I wanted the planet, you know, in a certain spot as well, and I just wasn't quite able to achieve that with this line. So I'll show you later though. I do work out how to resolve that, so I'm happy with it, but that's towards the end of the video. Now when you're doing wire work on top of beadwork like this, you definitely can use more than 2 wires. I've chosen, as I mentioned, to keep this quite simple, partly because there's a lot going on, and also partly because I really just didn't want to cover up too much of the beadwork here. If you are planning to be quite heavy-handed with the wire, so to speak, have a think about what you put underneath as far as beadwork. You may want to keep that quite simple, because then you're not going to see all of it through that wire work. Or alternatively, you could actually wrap so it's a more open weave. So I'm actually doing this quite tightly woven. Partly, a lot of it's because I'm just wanting that really strong flowing line between the planets. But what you could do if you wanted to would be to wrap around the one piece of wire, you know, multiple times, 5, 6, 7, whatever times, before you switch over and wrap across to the other piece of wire. And then you've got less junctions between the two wires, less wire covering, and so you can see through the two bits of wire more easily. So that's definitely something you could do. So you can see here I'm sort of just placing the planets there to have a look. Scooter comes up and has a look himself, who likes cuddling with me and tries to get as close as he can to my bead mat usually. And by placing the planets on the piece before I do the wire work, it gives me a bit of an idea where I want that wire work to be. And again, sew through, like wrap it in a little loop like I showed on the previous video, and then sew around that as much as you can so it's nice and secure. And at the end, once I do the backing, I use glue on top of everything as well, so it becomes even more secure. So I decided to bring that one right up to the end of the necklace there, but I obviously had to be very careful that it didn't stick out too much, so that once I'm finished I can, you know, trim it nice and neatly at the end, and I don't have wire sticking out anywhere. Now I like to use a very long piece of wire for my wire wrapping piece, and I've got a 26 gauge, or I like to use 28 gauge. I just didn't have any on hand, but this 26 gauge was working very nicely. I have been doing it quite tight, so I've just been doing the one wrap around the structural wire and then crossing over to the next wire, wrapping it, then one more wrap to secure it. That is the minimum. You know, you really want to make sure that you do at least do a wrap around the wire each time. Otherwise, it just becomes too loose. So if you were crossing back and forth between both bits of wire, my experience has been that that becomes quite loose and the wire work doesn't remain super tight. Of course, if you had very hard wire, so I'm using half hard, you might be able to sort of pull it very, very tight and it might be okay. But personally, I just haven't been able to get that to look nice. So I at least wrap around the piece of wire individually once between wraps so that it is really grabbing tightly onto there. And then a few wraps before the planet, and then decide when you want to put that wire through the center of the planet so that it comes out the other side and you can commence the beadwork on the other side of the planet. So each time I do a wrap, I make sure to pull it really nice and taut so that it's, because you can't really go back and tighten things up, it's very difficult. Usually if you really come into some trouble, you're best off just cutting off the excess wire and threading in a new piece of wire if it's either too kinked, or maybe even cutting out pieces of wire work if you're not happy with how they threaded. sometimes you can recover it and rewrap it, but it can be quite difficult. And especially with this thin wire, if you pull very tight or you wrap a number of times, the more a wire is bent, the more it's likely to get to its breaking point, because it becomes too brittle at that point. So yeah, just be careful about that. And it is definitely possible though to thread in new wire work. Sometimes I'll come up on the other side of the structural wire and, you know, meet in the middle. Sometimes I'll start exactly where I left off and wrap it around one of the bits of wire a couple of times first as the anchor point, and then I don't usually cut off the excess wire until I've wrapped a few back and forth, you know, loops to really secure it. Otherwise it gets a bit difficult. So this last one, I decide I want to actually go over the top of this larger planet and have it really hovering above there. I liked the look of that. My bead mat's getting a bit worse for wear during this process. At the end of making this necklace, I actually threw it in the bin because it was getting a little bit rough and I'd been using it for a while. So you can see like chunks of the fluff after a while start to just come off, and I think all of the wire sort of, you know, getting into that and pulling off bits meant I had to throw that out in the end. But it lasted me a good while. So you can see I've done this wire work so that planet just skims the one underneath. I really wanted to have it floating above because it just looked really cool, I thought. And the other one I put is also doing the same thing, so it just gives it a bit more dimensionality, being a little less pattern-like as well. It to me looked a bit more like what I would expect from Aughra's Observatory, where the planets were, you know, revolving in front of one another and that sort of thing. So again, you can see I'm going through the planet because I've beaded all the way up to that center point where, and you can see how I've flared out the structural wire on either side of the planet, and I just like that shape. My husband said they reminded him of the little snitches from Harry Potter, and I think that's probably exactly what they look like. Wrong pop culture reference though. So you can do all sorts of things with wire work on top of beadwork. You know, it's really limited to your imagination. It definitely does take patience. I wouldn't rush it, especially because of all the work you would have put into the beadwork. So kind of reminds me a little bit of Bob Ross and the way he says you have to be brave and, you know, jump in there and do it, sort of thing. So it's a brave piece of wire that you're doing there. Now when it gets a bit tight, just get in there with your pliers. I was running very short on wire at this point, but I definitely didn't want to add more to that piece. Now, I ended up making some additional planets. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I wasn't happy with everything, and I also really liked the idea of having some planets sitting at the end of these little spring shapes. And in fact, looking at Aughra's Observatory, there were sections that were sort of mounted on thicker pipe things, and I thought that's perfect. I really wanted to do that. So you can see I've used the wire through the spring and threaded it back through again. Now, I started out with the size, the 26 gauge wire. I don't show it, but I actually ended up going back through with the 24 gauge. Just, I wanted some added stability. It is trickier to get through all the sections with the 24 gauge, definitely was, but I feel like it's much stronger for doing it. So yeah, just have a think about that too, I guess. And I had a spring on the other side, so I did exactly the same thing for that side and put a planet there as well. Now that section I mentioned that I didn't really like the flow, I decided to put a planet right at the base of one of those bits of wire work, and I really liked the way that turned out then. So here's the Aughra's Observatory part of the necklace. We'll be going on to do the wire work at the bottom next for the shard. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this series so far, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye guys.